By all accounts, Ethiopia and Eritrea should already be at war.
Ethiopia and Eritrea could be headed towards war.
For the past 3 years, experts and news reports have been warning that conflict is coming.
There are fears of war.
Another conflict has been gaining momentum.
The two look set for a return to conflict.
And they have good reason. On the ground, troops are moving toward the border, and the rhetoric on both sides is escalating.
ናይ መወዳእታ ፈተነ እያ ትኸውን
መስተልና ናይ ምክልኻል ንዝኾነ ወገን ንሓተሉ ምኽንያት የለን
If this conflict breaks out, it wouldn't stay contained. It could pull in multiple countries and destabilize the entire region. And yet, the first shot hasn't been fired. The silence remains for now. So, what's actually holding this war back? And could it be avoided entirely?
Things are really at an all-time point of tension in terms of the recent years.
Just a few years ago, this wasn't the situation at all.
Ethiopia and Eritrea declare that war has come to an end.
The two leaders signing a peace deal, restoring diplomatic and trade relations.
In 2018, Ethiopia and Eritrea ended 2 decades of hostility with a historic peace deal. But that peace didn't last. By 2020, it had turned into something else entirely, a military alliance. The two countries became brothers in arms, fighting side by side in the Tigray war against a common enemy, the TPLF. For 2 years, their interests were perfectly aligned. But in 2022, the war ended, and with it, the alliance collapsed. Eritrea was left out of the final peace deal. Ethiopia began to move on. And without a common enemy holding them together, the relationship quickly fell apart. Today, both countries are once again on a war footing. And at the center of it all is the sea. Ethiopia is the world's most populous landlocked country, and right now, about 95% of its trade depends on a single route through Djibouti. That dependence costs the country around $1.6 billion every year. For its Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, that's not just expensive, but it's also a vulnerability, a geographic prison, as he puts it. And that's why this isn't just about access, it's about control. Ethiopia doesn't just want to use a port, it wants sovereign control, the coast. But every attempt to secure that has run into resistance. Talks with Somalia collapsed last year over Ethiopia's demand for a naval base, and the controversial 2024 deal with Somaliland has stalled under international pressure. And this brings us to the current tension with Eritrea. Ethiopia's focus now lies on a port it used to own, Asab. It sits just 60 kilometers from the border. Abiy's government has repeatedly made claims for it, arguing it is a strategic necessity. But for Eritrea, it looks like a direct threat to sovereignty. On paper, this is exactly how war starts, but something is holding it back. The first reason is simple. Ethiopia's army isn't just preparing for war, it's already fighting one. Right now, the military is stretched across multiple fronts. In the Amhara region, a militia known as Fano has grown into a powerful insurgent force, controlling large parts of the countryside. Further south, a persistent guerrilla war in Oromia continues to drain troops and resources. This isn't one conflict, it's several happening at the same time. And that creates a problem, because to launch a war against Eritrea, Ethiopia would need to concentrate its forces in the north. But every time it pulls troops out of these regions, it risks losing control on the ground. We have already seen what that looks like. Earlier this year in February, as troops were deployed toward the northern border, insurgent groups quickly moved in to exploit the gap. And that is the dilemma. Opening a new front doesn't just stretch the military, it risks something far worse, internal collapse. But even that isn't the biggest obstacle. The real problem is Tigray, because any war with Eritrea would have to pass through it. And right now, Tigray isn't a stable front, it's a divided one. Since the 2022 peace deal, relations between the federal government and the TPLF have broken down. A hardline faction led by Debretsion Gebremichael is in full control of the region and has shifted in a very different direction. Instead of aligning with Addis Ababa, it has moved closer to Eritrea. That shift is already creating real obstacles on the ground. Earlier this year, clash broke out in the Tsalemti area as Tigrayan forces tried to assert control over disputed territory. And shortly after, Tigray's interim authorities made their position clear. Federal troops would not be allowed to move through the region towards the Eritrean border. And that changed the equation completely. Because if war breaks out, Ethiopia might not just face Eritrea across the border. It could face resistance from inside Tigray as well. A second front in a region that was supposed to be secure. But the constraints don't stop there. While Ethiopia has the incentive to start a war, Eritrea doesn't. Because Ethiopia is the one pushing for change, while Eritrea is trying to preserve the status quo. And it's doing that without firing a single shot. Instead of confronting Ethiopia directly, Eritrea has focused on something more effective, keeping it internally divided. Reports over the past year indicate growing support for armed groups opposing the federal government, including long-standing ties with Fano militias in Amhara. The same logic applies in Tigray. So by aligning with factions hostile to Addis Ababa, Eritrea has effectively created a buffer zone in Ethiopia's northern border rather than a battlefield. And that shifts the balance completely, because as long as Ethiopia is busy internally, it can project power outward, which means Eritrea doesn't need to take the first shot, it just needs to wait. And then there is the cost, because beyond the military, Ethiopia is also under financial pressure. The country is in the middle of a fragile economic recovery, backed by international lenders like the IMF. The government is locked in delicate negotiations with international partners to restructure its national debts and implement economic reforms. And those deals depend on one thing: stability. A full-scale war wouldn't just be expensive, it could collapse the entire economy. And that's a price Ethiopia can't afford to pay. So when you put it all together, a very different picture starts to emerge. The pressure for war is real. Ethiopia wants access to the sea. It views it as an existential necessity. But every path toward that goal runs into a wall. The military is stretched thin by conflicts at home, and Tigray is no longer a reliable front, but a potential one. Eritrea may not push for escalation because it's benefiting from the current instability, and economically, the cost of war could be catastrophic. So, what's stopping this conflict isn't a lack of tension, it's the weight of these constraints. What looks like restraint is actually pressure. But this balance is fragile, because none of these constraints are permanent. Internal conflicts can shift, alliances can change, economic pressure can break. And beyond Ethiopia and Eritrea, the region itself is becoming more contested, with Red Sea trade routes, regional rivalries, and external powers all in play. Which means if this conflict does erupt, it won't stay contained. For now, the silence on the border holds. But in the Horn of Africa, silence isn't peace. It's pressure waiting to break.